Well, it is so good to see you. It's time for our weekly Bible story. It's time for us to continue these lessons that we're doing together, these stories that we're doing together that lead all the way from when God created the world to God sending Jesus to help us and to bless us and to set us free and to make us his own. And we are still near the pretty beginning of the story. We're talking about a family. Remember, we started talking about Abraham, and then we talked about Abraham's son Isaac. And then Isaac had two sons, Jacob and Esau, and we're following Jacob, right? That's where the main part of the story goes, through Jacob. So Jacob, when we last talked, had been running away from his brother Esau. You remember why, right? That Jacob had stolen first his brother's birthright and then his brother's blessing, and Esau was mad. So Rebekah and Isaac sent Jacob away. They said, go back to Rebekah's people, to her family, to her brother Laban, and stay there a while. Maybe find a nice girl there to marry. And when Esau cools down, then you come home. Do you remember the story? So Jacob headed off to his uncle's house. And on the way, he fell asleep and he had this dream where God appeared to him. And there was a ladder between heaven and earth and angels going up and down. And God said to Jacob, all this land, the land you're sleeping on, all of it, look north, south, east, west, it's all going to be yours. And I am going to bless the whole world through your family. Don't worry, I'll be with you. I'll take care of you. Remember, Jacob woke up and he poured oil on that rock and he set up a little altar to God, and then he called it Bethel, right? And then he went over, he kept going on his journey, and he went to his uncle Laban's house. Now, if you remember where we stopped last time, he had gotten to a place, there were shepherds around. He said, do you boys know anybody named Laban? They said, absolutely. And here's his daughter, Rachel. And remember, it was a little bit of a kissing story. There's more kissing today, sadly. But Jacob had looked, and Rachel was the prettiest girl he had ever seen. And he gave her a kiss, and he cried because he was so happy to have found her. And when the story ended, she had run back to tell her daddy Laban that he had a nephew there, and she found him kind of interesting. So today we pick up there. So Laban came running back to where Jacob was by the well, and he picked him up and he dusted him off, he kissed him, and he welcomed him into his house and took care of him. And Jacob was there for about a month, and then they had a conversation about, well, what should happen now? And Jacob had already started working for Laban, you know, helping out with the animals and doing chores and fixing stuff up and doing all the things that you should do when you're visiting someone, when you stay there for a while. Jacob had already started doing that, and Laban said to him, you know, you've been here a month, you've been working real hard, I'm appreciating that. I don't know how long you're staying, but I should be paying you something. And Jacob said, well, how about this? Let me marry your daughter. And Laban said, really? You want to work for me, and your wages, your pay would be that you get to marry my daughter? Okay. You work for me for 7 years. You can marry my daughter. Whoa, 7 years. Can you imagine working for 7 years? But Jacob really thought Rachel was pretty. He really thought she was special. And so he stuck out his hand and he said, deal. I'll work for you for 7 years and you let me marry Rachel. And because he was in love, the time just flew by. It didn't seem like 7 years at all. Jacob worked really hard. He made Laban a lot of money, made Laban much richer because, you know, he worked with the animals and he was good with them, and there were more sheep and more cattle and more goats and more camels, and he worked 7 years. And at the end of 7 years, he went to Laban and he said, okay, I've worked 7 years. Now I want to marry your daughter. And Laban said, yep, that was the deal. and they set up a big party, and they invited everybody, and everybody came. Now, there were some traditions that you don't know about in this time. You've been to weddings where the bride wears a veil on her face, right? But not all the time anymore. And the veils are very thin. I mean, you can see absolutely who it is. But in those days, the veils were complete. So Jacob's standing next to a woman wearing a veil. He has no idea really who's under that veil, but he's so excited because he knows it's his honey Rachel. And, there are no light bulbs in this time. There's torches, there's candles, right? So they have the party, right? It's Jacob and his new wife, and there's the singing, and there's the eating and the drinking, and then the two of them have their evening together. And in the morning when Jacob woke up, he wasn't with Rachel. Laban had tricked him. The woman under the veil was Rachel's sister Leah. Now, Leah, from all accounts, was a very nice person. She had weak eyesight. That's all the Bible says that's wrong with her. But Jacob didn't love her. He loved Rachel. He didn't love her sister Leah. I mean, you know that your parents, they're nice to your other parents' brothers and sisters, but they don't love them like they love your other parent, right? Oh, Jacob was so mad. And he went to Laban and he said, "You tricked me. I was going to work for Rachel for 7 years and you gave me Leah. It's totally unfair." And Laban said, "Oh, there's a thing. We don't like when the baby sister gets married before the big sister. So that's why I did it. I'll tell you what, though. You work for me another 7 years, I'll let you marry Rachel." And Jacob really wanted to marry Rachel. And he said, "All right. But first I marry Rachel, and then I'll work the next 7 years." And Laban said, "Okay." Because in this time, men could have more than one wife. It's a little bit different than our time too, isn't it? Anyway, so they had the party for that whole week with Jacob marrying Leah, and then they had another party where Jacob married Rachel, and then Jacob went back to work for Laban and worked another 7 years. And after he'd worked 14 years, they made another deal where Jacob would continue to work for Laban, and they would split the livestock that was born during that time. And so he worked 6 more years for Laban. And at the end of the 20 years, he was with his uncle for 20 years, waiting for his brother to cool down. At the end of the 20 years, he had 2 wives, 11 sons, a daughter, and all kinds of animals. Just tons of them, heaps of them, camels and goats and sheep and cattle. He had become a very rich man. But it was time to go home. It was time to figure out what was going to happen with Esau. It was time to see his folks again. Both his folks were still alive, still waiting. It was time to go home. So he packed everything up, and his wives packed everything up, and they headed back down that road that we've talked so many times about, back to the land that God had promised to Abraham, and then to Isaac, and then to Jacob. And that's where we'll pause for today. When we pick up, Jacob has to deal with Esau. Esau has to deal with Jacob. They're brothers. They've got to work this thing out. So what do I need from you? I would love if you'd send me a picture of some part of this. I would love if you would send me questions about some part of this. I would love to hear what you're thinking about these stories that we're telling. I am so proud of you. I'm so proud of how you're growing. I'm excited for those of you who are going back to school in the next few days, that you're going to continue to learn and to grow, so that Jesus can use you and you can be a gift to our town and to our church. Everything's good. Everything's a little weird with this COVID, but everything is good. And God will take care of all of us. So you think about Jacob, you think about how he got married not once but twice, you think about how God blessed him and made him rich, and you kind of start wondering about how it's going to work going home to Esau. Is there going to be trouble? Is there going to be violence? What's going to happen? I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.